please help me in welcoming to the meeting, Terry Watada.
Thank you, Richard, very much. Can you hear me? You can hear me, right?
We can hear you great.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Yes, thank you to the congenial Richard there for hosting this and giving me such a warm welcome. And I also like to thank Michelle Edmonds for her organizing skills and for asking me. I get the feeling Wei had something to do with this as well, but we'll get to that later, I suppose. All right, so I am a Sansei, a third generation Japanese Canadian, the second generation to be born in Canada. And I'm going to be talking about my parents and my, well, I won't mention my grandparents too much because I didn't know them very well. In fact, I never met them, any of them. But anyway, why do I write? Well, when I was 19, which is about 1,000 years ago, I saw an exhibit of internment camp photos. And this was the first exhibit of these photos. I think they came from the archives in Ottawa and from the archives at UBC. UBC students who were Asian Canadian, mostly Japanese Canadians, put this together and showed it in Vancouver first and then brought it to Toronto. And it was part of a conference, the very first Asian Canadian conference to discuss identity, racism, the internment, all kinds of topics as well. There were lots of performances as during that during the conference, as well as personal discussions in the living room. It was held in a house downtown. But anyway, I saw these internment camp photos, bleak, rather black and white images of the internment camps, which I had never seen before. And I was shocked. My assumption was that, my parents came to BC. My dad worked as a lumberjack. I saw all the photos of the camps, lumber camps, sorry. And my mother and brother lived in Vancouver itself. And then for some reason they moved to Toronto. And that was it. In between, I didn't question it. I don't know what happened. I just assumed they just moved to Toronto because they liked it better. So anyway, I went to my parents directly and asked them, about this experience. Did this really happen to us? Because there were no pictures of them in the camps. And my mother was quite angry. She said, "You don't need to know that stuff," and called me an idiot. One of many times actually, but it started me on my quest to know things. I realized that my history, my roots, my culture were taken from me. I was like a tree without roots, basically. And I also learned about, not only from my parents and brother, who was 18 years older than I was, so he went through the whole experience. He was also reticent to talk about it till much later. I learned about Powell Street in Vancouver, where most of the Japanese Canadians lived, around that whole area. And there were businesses there and institutions and schools, all kinds of things. And I wanted to know about that because I had no knowledge of the life there in that community. It was a real community, which I didn't have in Toronto per se. So I started writing songs, first about my parents and their experience. From what I could glean and from anecdotes by other friends of the family. Turns out I was the first to do so. No idea I was doing that. Luckily, there was an audience. In the 1972 conference, as I mentioned, there was a arts night, and I was the MC as well as a performer. And I received a warm reception, and it inspired me to go on. Later on in 1977 was the first Powell Street Festival, an arts and culture festival for Japanese Canadians, or for and of Japanese Canadians in Vancouver. And so I was invited to the first one and performed many, many songs back there. And then the redress movement came along, and my services were called upon to not only entertain, but to inform and educate people. I really love the student performances. I went to various schools and educational institutions to perform, and lots of good questions. Now, that not only in Canada, from right across Canada, actually, from Montreal all the way to Vancouver. I also went to the US, and I guess I was, a novelty for them. It turned out that they didn't know. They had no idea that the internment took place in Canada as well as the United States. And two fantastic people I met were Yuri and Bill Kochiyama, both activists. Yuri, especially, she was, I guess she was immortalized in a photo of her giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to Malcolm X when he was shot at the Audubon Auditorium. But anyway, Bill and Yuri became key figures in the movement, redress movement, in other words, other movements as well, certainly civil rights. And Bill, in particular, he confessed to me that they had never heard of the internment in Canada and said that we had it a lot tougher. So I corrected him, not me, I didn't go through it, but my parents and certainly my brother did. So that was worthwhile going down there and doing it. One of the most ironic performances I did was at the, what was it called? I think it was just simply the Roosevelt House, which was on Riverside Drive in the north end of the city of Manhattan, sorry. And it's now part of a university. And I was sitting in one of the drawing rooms playing music for the people. And I realized that it was probably in that room that FDR was talking to people about the Japanese American internment. And I think it was, who was the FBI head at that point? Very famous man. Of course, I can't remember his name now, but he said, "This is stupid. Why are you interning hundreds, maybe thousands of dirt farmers? They're not going to cause any trouble." And FDR looked at him and said, "I've got to be shown to be doing something. So this is what I did." So, okay, fine. Anyway, I began writing poetry in 1984 when my mother passed. I realized that I've got all these stories, but if I don't record them, I'm going to lose them. So I wrote notes, all the stories and memories of my mother that I had. And out of that, I composed a long poem. And fortunately, it was a finalist in the CBC National Poetry Contest. So it gave me enough encouragement to continue. And it became a core poem for my first collection of poems, 1,000 Homes. And as time went on, I discovered many stories from talking to Issei, first the pioneer generation, the ones that immigrated to Canada, and the Nisei, their children, the firstborn in Canada. And I got many stories, especially Richard mentioned that I had written 2 books on the Buddhist history in Canada. Well, the first Buddhist history was the 100th anniversary of the church, and of the Japanese Canadian church. And I had various, seems like weekly meetings with the organizing committee. And it was comprised of the older folks, the Nisei, and they would just go into anecdote after anecdote. It was like these meetings should have taken place in an hour at the most, but these were 2-3 hour meetings. But I didn't mind because they talked about their lives and the things that happened to them before the war and during the war and shortly after the war. And it helped a great deal. It helped. So I was armed with all this material. And so I decided, well, why don't I write a novel? And a good friend of mine, Jim Wong Chu in Vancouver, suggested again, an agent, a literary agent. So he actually set up a meeting with one in Toronto. And I met with her, and she said I should write, I told her my idea, and she said I should write one big novel. Big novels are in, like I forget, my mind is going here, but there were a lot of big novels back then. Satanic Verses was one of them. Huge 1,000-page novels, and I should take all three, all these stories and put it into one. So when I came back, maybe 6 months later, and she just said, "Oh, big novels are out now." So, well, thanks a lot. So I thought, and so she didn't take me on as a client anyway, so it didn't really matter. But I was inspired to write a trilogy of novels. The first one being The Blood of Foxes, which was based on a true crime story before the war within the JC community. Now, I find this fascinating because Japanese Canadians, our grandparents' generation, they didn't do stuff like this. They didn't commit crimes, right? I mean, they were just law-abiding people. And of course, I bought into the stereotype. Turns out there was a gang with the Black Dragon gang. There was a Yakuza organization in Japan called the Black Dragons, and they came to North America. And one of the men in there, in fact, he turned out to be the bodyguard of the head guy, was a good friend of my father's. And I saw him all the time, at various holiday dinners, anniversary celebrations, whatever. And this guy was the scariest man in the world. I mean, his head looked like a skull, right? It was thin, and he had a really raspy voice, and his teeth were all brown and whatever, He just, he was a violent man, so I was told. I never saw that. He was a gambler and a womanizer, et cetera, et cetera. His name was Riki Matsu, and he was a jewel thief, a smuggler. There are rumors of him murdering people, but never proven. But it was fascinating that he was the boss's right-hand man, and the boss's name was Mori, Etsuji Mori. And so I did a lot of research into Mori, and that was difficult because not a lot of people wanted to talk about him. One of the one of the elders of the Japanese Canadian newspaper, the Nikkei Voice, which I wrote for, I talked to him, and I said, tell me a little bit about him, and he did, but he said, you should not write about Etsuji Mori or Riki Matsu or any of that guys. So why not? He says, because they're going to threaten you. They're going to come after you. They want anonymity. They want secrecy. I said, geez, how old are these guys? Well, they're probably in their 80s now. I said, well, I think I can outrun them, So I went ahead and no problems whatsoever. So that was the first book, The Blood of Foxes. And then I came to the second book, which was about the Nisei, the second generation. And again, it was based on my stereotype again of the Nisei, where that they were law-abiding, always forward-thinking, ambitious, but didn't want to cause any problems. Well, I found out that there were protest groups within the Nisei generation. They wanted to fight back. They didn't want to go to these camps until it was inevitable that they had to go. They outnumbered, outgunned, whatever. And so, but they still led protests against the government and the powers that be. And so that produced my second novel, The Three Pleasures. The third novel was about the Sansei, my generation, the third generation. And there were two areas of focus. I guess I can show this. This is it here. It just came out in last December. And two areas of focus. It was based on a friend of mine, an actual friend of mine who who one day decided to rob a bank. Now, this is a guy who just got his master's degree in commerce. Well, I guess there is a connection there. He decided, well, I'm going to go rob a bank. And the reason he did that, he said, was to avenge his grandfather's incarceration during World War II in the internment camp. So, because he asked for a specific amount, $20,000, which was the same amount that the National Association of Japanese Canadians was asking for during their negotiations. They got a little more than that, but they started at that base. Somebody mentioned Gordon Hirabayashi, and he was part of that movement and negotiating from Edmonton, of all places, Sorry, Dana. Yeah, so he actually went in there. It turns out he had no intention of taking the money. He just threatened with a bomb, which he said was in his gym bag. Of course, there was no bomb, but they arrested him quickly, threw him in jail, and he got out on bail. And I met with him and talked to him. And it turns out he was against redress in the first place. So why did you do this? And he said, because I wanted to shame the Japanese Canadians into stopping, the redress movement. Forget about it. It's not important. We made it on our own. We rose above our situation, like my grandfather did, like my parents did, like your parents did, Terry. So give it up. So I thought they would shame them. This act would shame them. And they would realize how greedy they are. That, okay, I'm going to go back to planet Earth now. So that's the first focus. The second part is about the narrator looking for his father, who disappeared when he was 15 years old. He was flying north of Lake Superior. Nobody knew why, when the plane crashed. And they never found the body. They don't know why the plane crashed, et cetera, et cetera. And so the son, the narrator, the son, went on a quest to find out what was going on. He found a dream diary in the basement, packed away in a trunk. And he used clues from that to find his father. And it turns out that his father was part of the Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan protest. Now, I didn't know about this either, And I went, when I was researching for the Buddhist book, I traveled to the south of southern end of Alberta and talked to Niseis down there and Sanseis as well. And I met one man who just sat in his living room and staring at an artifact up over his mantle, and it was a harpoon. And so I asked, middle of, southern Alberta, so I had to ask, why does he stare at that? And he says he was a whaler at one time before World War II. And so how did he end up in southern Alberta, and didn't he go back up there? He said, no, he was part of the protest. So what protest? For 2 years after World War II, this is after World War II, about 300 Japanese Canadians staged a protest in a RCAF Air Force base. And they stayed there for 2 years until they were literally dragged out of the place and thrown in front. But two of those guys kept it going. They were actually, people donated tents and food, and they stayed there for about, what was it, 160 days more to protest the war. So I got to hand it to these guys. And this man I was with was one of those two guys. And I just had to wonder. He wouldn't speak to me. He wouldn't talk about anything. He just sat there staring at his harpoon. At least that's my memory of it. But I find it fascinating that they would have this sort of inner strength to do that. I mean, really, they were part of the group that was in Angler, Ontario, which is north of Lake Superior. And maybe that's why the father was there looking for angler. And they were the so-called troublemakers of BC, the teachers, the lawyers, the doctors, anyone with an opinion. They were rounded up by the Canadian government and thrown into prison camps, first in Petawawa near Ottawa, and then they got moved to Angler, which was north of Lake Superior. And again, they were seen as troublemakers because they had an opinion. And this was also covered in the second book, The Three Pleasures, but it continues its resolution in book 3, The Mysterious Dreams of the Dead. And so I wanted to look at that protest in Moose Jaw. At the same time, I also looked at Japanese Canadian culture and community. None of this had been written down per se, hinted at in various texts and whatever, but nobody ever defined it. So I wanted to do that as well. Now, for Toronto, especially, since the main character in the third novel lives in Toronto, coincidentally, I do too. Anyway, I would argue that there was a Japantown in the Spadina and Dundas area mixed with the Chinese immigrants as well, the first and second generation Chinese immigrants. And so I decided to write about it, put it in this book, and I'm going to read an excerpt from The Mysterious Dreams of the Dead, which talks about that whole area. For those who live in Toronto, those who are visiting Toronto, this may be a revelation, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, here it is, an excerpt from the novel. The pewter sky was oppressive as we shuffled along Sullivan Street from the Art Gallery streetcar stop at Beverly Street. The sidewalk was hard, brittle, and unyielding, but the bare trees bent over slightly as if to welcome us. The front yards and gardens were empty, since there had been no snow since last November, when the first snowfall came as a flurry, but didn't stick. We walked hand in hand, or rather glove and mitten, even though it was as cold as a well-digger's ass. From within her heavy coat and hood, Naoko kept looking at the house number zipping past, anxious to find my mother's place. I peered into the surrounding darkness, imagining the shadows of Little Tokyo accompanying us. It actually wasn't called Little Tokyo or Japantown or J-Town back in the 1950s and 60s. It was just a neighborhood where we first lived. Every Nikkei individual and institution started life in Toronto there. The Watadas lived on McCall Street. The Ishidas, Matsubas, Kiyonagas, Nakamuras, Sugiuras, Tabuchis, and so many more lived on adjoining streets. The first Toronto Buddhist church started in a row house on Huron Street. The Reverend Tsuji and his wife lived in the crowded space. The planning of the Buddhist church on Bathurst took place there, as did that of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. Members of the various Kenjin-kai and the political arm of the community, the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association, met in the back room of the Nikko Garden restaurant. The New Canadian and the Continental Times, both on Queen Street near Spadina, kept churning out weekly issues with community news for a shrinking subscriber base. Nikkei businesses sprang up within the confines. The Tsuji brothers opened an auto repair garage in a back alley, illegal, but it made money. A Japanese and later English language bookstore opened by Kamaoka-san ran out of his house on Sullivan Street. The Kawasaki's corner store, with 3 young brothers always fighting, sat on Huron and Dundas. The food co-op nearby, operated by the Buddhist church, eventually turned into Furia, a Japanese grocery store with a somber Mr. Ishida as a butcher and a smiling and friendly Mrs. Ishida on the fish counter. Perched above was Miko Garden, the first formal dining Japanese restaurant in Toronto, owned and run by Gus and Jim Karonaga, brothers who hated each other, so much so that Gus acted as a maitre d' while Jim worked in the back. Or was it the opposite? The farthest out point outpost east was the Ginza Cafe at Bay and Dundas, where anyone could get teishoku, ochasuke, and denbatsuke at the long counter. Other Japanese grocery stores opened out and spread out across the nexus of Spadina and Dundas. Sandon Market, Sanko Trading, and the venerable Dundas Union. Harry Sugimoto, his family stuck in a house on Dundas so narrow you could touch each wall by spreading your arms, would soon open Danforth Cleaners in the East End when he made a little money. Dr. Kuwabara, family doctor, and Dr. Nakashima, a dentist, were together at Spadina and Bloor. The Nikkei youth also had fun. The Nisei Club staged parties like the Harvest Dance, the Sadie Hawkins Do, and the Christmas social at the Hagerman Hall, located right in the heart of the original Chinatown. Much to the dismay of their Issei elders who frowned on touch dancing, bowling and ice hockey leagues formed. Sansei attended Japanese language classes twice a week at the YMCA at College and Young. The Nikkei would not move into the suburbs near and far until later, when racist tensions and restrictions eased. If they ended up living in the same neighborhood, never mind street, was by pure happenstance. Most families did not want to be Japanese Canadians by that point. All the Nisei homes, businesses, and institutions were gone or virtually gone by the 90s, becoming ghosts haunting me as childhood memories does everyone. So that's my description of, Little Tokyo, for want of a better word. One of the great festivals or holidays for the Japanese Canadian community is Oshogatsu, or New Year's, but it's New Year's Day, it's not New Year's Eve. Most Japanese Canadian families spent the eve making or preparing the food for New Year's Day. And so I wrote a little bit, here's a little bit of a description of that tradition, as well as pushing forward the plot. The New Year's feast had become a little sad, with no one coming over to visit. Friends and relatives stopped just before the 1990s. Mom made a small amount of sushi, futomaki, and agezushi only. She also prepared a smattering of tempura, morsels of char-siu, bought at Golden City, no doubt, and a plate of chow mein, Japanese Canadian style. There was a pot of steamed rice, a staple. We weren't iconoclasts after all. But gone were the days of abundant delicacies, though Boku's mom and others still put on the hog. I stopped going, given what happened to my pal. Besides, I was no longer invited, and I understood, too embarrassed since I knew too much. Naoko was all smiles as I opened the front door and we took off our shoes in the hallway. I followed her down the long, dark hall to the dining room in the back. Okasan greeted her with as much warmth as she could muster. My mother's eroded face, thinning hair, and the slight stoop in her back slowed her down just to a shuffle. Naoko bowed and said something in Japanese while presenting her host with a bouquet of flowers. I could see Okasan was pleased, surprised, even uplifted by my girlfriend. She always encouraged me to bring home my romantic interest, though I always suspected she wanted to check them out, make sure they were the right kind. I can marry anyone you want. You can marry anyone you want as long as she's Japanese, she used to say. Though it was early in our relationship, I decided to bring Naoko home. She was the first, and it felt right. Oka made the effort to bring clean plates to the table when Naoko jumped up to help. No, you sit. Michael, help me, she commanded. Oh, right, sorry. We spent a pleasant hour or two celebrating New Year's and my perceived escape from celibacy. With the final "Gotso-sama," my mother pulled me aside. Michael, you'd better be careful with that one. Why? Well, she's Japanese. Well, I thought you'd be pleased. Yes, but you aren't used to such girls. They're so different from Canadian girls. They're not spoiled, Sansei. Now you're nuts, Ma. You wanted me to date Japanese, and now that I was, she seemed to be telling me to dump her. Michael, she said with a grab my arm. Yeah, Ma, she's not what she seems. So I'll leave that mystery for your reading, I guess. Each novel was inspired by new facts at least new to me. And they spurred me on to write. And as I mentioned, the Nisei protest, from those many from Angler and moving east, no, moving west. Moose Jaw did have a defunct Royal Canadian Air Force base there, and it became a distribution center. Now, I don't know why they just didn't let them out of the camps and just go where they wanted to, except for the West Coast, which the BC government said no. And as I said, the protest carried on for 2 years. There was a death there because of a hunger strike. That's a true story. A woman, her body couldn't take it. And so I based the third novel around this story. As I said, it was interesting that they didn't let them go from the camps directly and just to go anywhere. They could move anywhere in Canada except Toronto, which put a ban on Japanese Canadians settling in the city. The ones that were already there were allowed to stay because they were either students of the University of Toronto, or they had jobs and established lives well before World War II. So that carried on until 1949, when all restrictions were lifted. And so I read now a section on the Moose Jaw incident or experience, and should give you some insight into what went on there. Early autumn 1945, a cold day, raining hard when they announced the end of the war. I didn't believe them. They lied to us about Hiroshima. How could one bomb kill 70,000 people? About the emperor capitulating? He would rather die for Japan. He was Japan. Only the traitors believed. How was any of that possible? Then they released us. I warned the traitors, if you leave Angler, you will die unhealed. But they left, running out on us and leaving the 7 of us to carry on the battle. We were the genuine article, believing in Japan's just cause, the Gambaria. We alone stood as a bulwark against the deceit of the Canadian government. We alone would bring honor to our families. We alone would win. We stayed as a protest. 1946, told to leave in no uncertain terms, Toss says, we got a vamoose, but we said no. Even the gates are wide open, machine gun towers empty, and the barbed wire cut in places. We were staying to fight the good fight, even if they dismantled the camp around us. Summer 1946. Jimmy Isojima, Takashi Kawai, Daniel Sugiura, Tamio Tanemitsu, Bullet, Kotanda, Tosh Umeda, and I were herded at gunpoint onto a train headed west. We were still at war. The rifles proved that. We weren't the only ones. About 130 others came along. The train was meant to carry freight. The floor was bare wood covered with a thin layer of hay. Slivers plagued us. Bugs bit us. The sliding doors were shut tight. Dust particles flew in the air, choking all of us. Between the slats, I could see the landscape slowing, moving past. We were like cattle. We finally came to a stop and detrained in the middle of nowhere at a place called Moose Jaw, a hick town if I ever saw one. We threw around the question, why here? It made no sense. We had to get used to Saskatchewan. The military boys took us to an installation 4 miles south of town. The sign above the camp identified it as RCAF Station Moose Jaw, established 1940. The locals, as I later learned, called it the Moose Jaw Hostel. It was just another prison camp to us. The training air base was well guarded and with double barbed wire fences. We were greeted by the hostel supervisor, Jack McKillop. I didn't know his connection to the military, but he was the head honcho. That was clear. This was a man who wouldn't take any guff from the likes of us. His posture was as straight as a grain elevator, his gloved hands large, solid like rocks, I imagine. He wasn't tall, but he wasn't short. His stocky build gave him the appearance of height. It was clear from the outset that he did not want to be bothered with us, but those were his orders. In other words, he was like every Popinjay commandant he had met along the way. I understand you don't want to be released, he said to us. The war is over, you know. You look like intelligent men. Why don't you just get on with your lives? I'm sure we can accommodate you and quickly provide transportation, provisions, and even some money. Well, they came to the point anyway. As for his question, I might have answered by asking, where can we go? We can't go back to Vancouver. Your boys have seen to that. There's a new law, but I remained silent, as did the rest of us. We were assigned barracks and kept out of trouble. It was a different place from the prisoner of war camps of Ontario. The living quarters were about as comfortable, small rooms inside metal cans, Quonset huts, I believe they were called, instead of wooden barracks. But there were very few guards, and the ones who were on duty were friendly, more or less. They didn't keep their distance like in the camps back east. The most remarkable feature of the hostel was the library. A library. I hadn't seen a book since walking down Main Street on a Sunday afternoon back home. I savored every volume I came across. Flaubert, Zola, Dylan Thomas, Orwell, Fitzgerald, and Hemingway. The sacred, the profane, the lovely, the disturbing. Then I came across The Holiest of Holy, The Dubliners by James Joyce, a collection with my favorite story, The Dead. Such was my joy. About a week later, something extraordinary happened. Members of various families from the BC camps started trickling into Moose Jaw. My father wasn't one of them. He had written to me, tell me he was going back east to a place called St. Catharines. He had pleaded with me to join him. I was his only family left since my older sister had disappeared into the woods. She was lost to us. So that is from my third novel, Mysterious Dreams of the Dead. As I said, each novel was inspired by a new fact that I learned in my travels and interviews. I thought I would finish, I guess, time is getting on. I discovered the tale of my wife's great aunt who survived Hiroshima for about 2 weeks. I also learned of the separation of babies from their mothers in Hastings Park, which was a detention center in Vancouver for all those Japanese Canadians who lived outside the city, up and down the coast. They were brought into Vancouver, and this is the place where they were put. It's part of the Pacific National Education. In fact, it was the horse barns of the Pacific National Education. And so they jerry-rigged a barracks, basically, cots one after the other, as well as individual horse stalls for the people, well, the families, the mothers and their children. The husbands and oldest sons were placed in another part of the building in similar situation. And this was a new fact I learned, that the Canadian government actually told the doctors, and I guess the doctors felt that they had to do this, if there was a child who was suspected of being ill, and there was a lot of, as you can imagine, illness, disease in that building, dysentery. I think there were even some cases of cholera in there. They would take the babies away so they wouldn't infect others. Of course, this is reminiscent of the Mexican-US border now, where they are separating children from their parents. So I decided to write about it for my fourth novel. And the novel is called Hiroshima Bomb Money, which is initially inspired by an artifact, my family artifact. It's about this chunk of metal, I guess. It's gray. If you look at it closely, you discover that there are coins all melted together into one mass. And it's in Japan, it's called bomb money. And what it is great aunt Chiemi received a bunch of money from her husband. Yeah, her husband, and for just in case, that he died in the war or they were short of cash. So she went in the backyard and dug a hole about a foot deep, and she buried it in there. Well, when the bomb went off, they were close to ground zero. Apparently, the radiation and the heat went down into the ground and melted the coins. And it's, as I said, it's a foot deep, and yet it affected the coins. And so when it was dug up later, her husband survived back, by the way, and came home, and they dug it up and they broke the pieces, the mass into 5 pieces, and gave each segment to a family member to keep as a family article, I guess. And so my wife's grandmother gave it to her and said, show them what they did to us. And so in effect, that's what I'm carrying out her wish. So anyway, this segment is from the Hastings Park experience, as it were. And so here it is. Once your baby was settled, Chisato immediately went next door to find Yaeko. She would know where the children were. Yaeko was asleep in her cot, but that didn't stop Chisato. She grabbed her by the front of her chemise and shook her awake. Yaeko-san, Yaeko, wake up. She groaned and cracked open her eyes. Yaeko, you've got to tell me where they put your baby. Wake up, wake up. When she fully came to and understood what was being asked of her, she shook her head and then buried her face in her pillow. Frustrated, Chisato let her go and told her to watch her child. Yaeko agreed and came to a seated position. Chisato then began wandering the crowded aisles of the pool, asking any if they knew where the sick babies and children were taken. No one knew, so she decided to walk to the hospital area of the building. Seemed like the logical place. It took a while, but a Japanese orderly finally pointed towards a distant corner of Building A. A former poultry barn was set up as a makeshift hospital with 180 beds. Stray lumps of straw supported about 60 beds. Adjacent to the area was an isolation ward for TB patients. Were these people to be deported? Chisato, as luck would have it, met a tall Japanese doctor with a toothy smile. Dr. Uchida kindly directed her to another area of the building. You want the quarantine area, he said in a soothing voice, for general disease. He pointed in a direction diagonally opposite the crude facilities. He looked concerned with furrowed brow and wouldn't say why. She soon found out. She wasn't sure what to expect, but once she got to the other side, she found a hole in the floor. Upon closer inspection, she discovered a staircase that led to a dark basement. In all good conscience, who would separate mothers and their children, sick or not? An exhaust of stale and fetid air rushed up from below to coat her in slime. Chisato covered her mouth and nose with her hand before stepping back. Her eyes watered. She wiped them with a sleeve on her other arm. The smell was evil. She hesitated to step on the first step, but then she did, and then stopped. It was like the blackness licked at her feet, pulling her down into the depths. She heard a chorus of babies and children calling, weeping and wailing, many asking for their mamas. She stood and retreated carefully. Stepping back onto the main floor as the sound of steps came rushing up, a woman in a nurse's uniform materialized, appearing from behind a curtain. She spoke sharply to her and motioned for her to move away. Chisato didn't understand her words, of course, but she obeyed. A nearby inmate told her the doctors keep the very sick children down in the dungeon, a cramped, pitch black room with no ventilation, coal dust, and little light. It was normally an underground coal and animal feed storage area, a true devil's room. How long, she asked. Until they're better or dead, the woman said ominously, usually 10 days, some for weeks. The next night, Sachiko was sick with worry, her strength sapped by it. All she could do was pray since no one listened to her pleas. After Hideko was sleeping soundly in her shared cot, Chisato sat up and saw that Sachiko was also asleep. The weight on her shoulders had grown noticeably heavier. Sachiko could do nothing to relieve the pressure. She sought peace in dreamless sleep. Chisato looked at Hideko and wondered what she would do if they came after her. She decided to look for Mary again. She stood up and moved out of the stall. The light was dull, but there was enough to be able to find her way. She soon enough came to the hole in the floor, a gaping grave. She took a deep breath and stepped down the steps. They creaked. She bent down and felt the running board of the staircase. Her other hand touched the wooden wall beside the staircase. There was no handrail. As she made her way down in a crouch, the darkness poured into her eyes, blinding her. She slowly sank into the blackness like wading into an inhospitable ocean. At the bottom of the stairs, she noticed there was a dull light source coming from somewhere, a small opening for an ancient coal chute. There were no windows. Some light came down the staircase, offering hope for escape, but no patient moved. No patient could. Chisato sensed the small size of the room. She could barely make out the large number of beds all crammed together. She felt the enormity of the situation. The place was hardly silent with soothing sleep. Coughing, crying, and desperation reigned. No nurse was on duty. In fact, no one was, not even guards. She perceived older girls moving from about, taking care or comforting the younger children. They coughed steadily and loudly as they did so. Everyone wallowed in their illness. No medical staff was present. Chisato started to whisper in a soft but hoarse voice, "Mari-chan, Mariko." Then she remembered. She said as best she could, "Mary." She repeated the name as she felt her way among the beds. Some children else asked, "Okacha?" "No, dear child. Please take me to her. Please take me out of here." An older girl lying with a baby asked, "Have you come to take us out?" "I'm sorry, no. I can't take care of all these baby boys myself. They need their mothers." "Why are you caring for them? Who else is there?" They began sobbing before Chisato. She lifted her hand to caress the teenager's hair. At that moment, a phalanx of light beams pierced the darkness from upstairs. Several footsteps rushed down the steps. Voices called out as the children sat up. Some startled and began to cry. Chisato froze. His hands grabbed her and began dragging her out of the dungeon. She protested in vain. Stop, I'm looking for Mary. Mary Chikimura. You must help me find her." Her words were in Japanese, of course. The anonymous staff couldn't understand a word. The next thing Chisato knew, she was sitting in an office with a gaijin in a suit and tie, sitting behind a desk in front of her. Two others were there, a nurse and a nisei, a kind-looking woman with a round face and sympathetic eyes. The interpreter, no doubt. I'll leave it there. At that point, well, so far, the reaction to the manuscript has been positive, and I'm encouraged to try to get it published. To end, I'd like to say over the years, I've developed an absolute love of Japanese Canadian culture and people, not the fake culture that organizations push to the public as representatives of JC culture. And I discover this largely through my parents' lives and their friends. So thank you for listening. I hope to continue researching and writing. There you go.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like everyone to take themselves off mute now and give Terry a proper old-fashioned round of applause, if we would please. Thank you so much for your discussion.